8.5 months pregnant with twins. So he told them goodbye and headed out to the airplane. So so basically, these guys took off. It says 7 o'clock, but it was really 6:59. Took off, headed for the Sea of Japan. You know, it was a nice, sunny, spring-like day. According to one of the other guys, there was a gentleman there that was Lieutenant Commander Overstreet's co-pilot about 3 months ago. And he was getting ready to go out in the very first mission with the EA-3, the first tactical mission. The squadron was getting EA-3s to replace these Connies, a jet, and it was going to do the same type of ELENT mission. So he recalls standing there, watching the Connie depart and how beautiful it was, because it is kind of a sight to behold and hear. And he watched that airplane depart into the early morning sun and said, wow, I wish I was going with those guys. And he jumped in his A3, EA3, for the very first tactical mission. He said they had all kinds of problems, bugs they were still working out. They were supposed to have a few more weeks, but as it was, they didn't. He was on his way to Da Nang via the Sea of Japan. He went to the Sea of Japan, did a little work there, and listened to those guys make their radio chatter and stuff. And then left to Da Nang. He got on the ground at Da Nang, and he heard that his shipmates were gone. So what happened? Well, this is a MiG-21, two MiG-21s actually, and that's what happened. So they departed at 7 o'clock. They got on station around 8:30 or so, and they had flown 1.5 laps at this time, and there was some reports. There was a radar station off the coast of Japan, a U.S. radar station off the coast of Japan, keeping track of what was going on and keeping track of this airplane and other activity. And there was some activity of North Korean MiGs along the coast doing coastal patrol. Not unusual. It was not unusual for these guys to be intercepted by the Russians. They'd never been intercepted by the North Koreans. But it was not unusual for Lieutenant Commander Overstreet and crew to have a Russian intercept. At 1:35, probably, maybe a little bit after Lieutenant Commander Overstreet had lunch, he probably sat back in the seat, checked in with the flight engineer, flying back in the seat for the rest of the trip, thinking that in a few more hours he's going to be on approach to Osan. And at 1:35, the station in Japan picked two MiGs coming off base that there usually wasn't MiGs near Wosan, and there's usually not MiGs. They picked up these two MiGs coming airborne, and they thought, well, that's interesting. And they were kind of, at that time, 150 miles from Lieutenant Commander Overstreet, and they kind of turned that direction, then they disappeared off the radar for a few minutes. So at 13:40, they sent a warning to Lieutenant Commander Overstreet. There's some reports say that it was acknowledged, some reports say that it wasn't, nobody really knows. But they sent him a warning that there were two MiGs airborne, and then the MiGs popped up again at about 13:40 or so, a few minutes after that. They disappeared from radar, and then one of them popped back up. The suspicion is that one of the MiGs went down low on the water. The other one set up a coastal picket 65 miles away, and the other MiG went down low in the water and disappeared off the radar, and then popped back up and got radar vectors or whatever until they found the Connie. Now, at this time, the ground guys off Japan are sending messages. They sent a couple warning messages called critic messages. But I can tell you that, they didn't need the messages. They had the radar, and this was their job in the Gulf of Tonkin, was looking for MiGs. That was their job. So they knew that they had MiGs coming. whether they got any messages or not. They could see them. So it appears that Lieutenant Commander Overstreet turned east to leave the area. There was no time to get a radio call off that they're aborting the mission or anything else, but he was definitely leaving the area, heading east. They could probably see on the radar the MiG's closing at 10 miles a minute. They're in that unarmed Connie trying to get away, doing about 4 miles a minute. Okay? And so it doesn't take long for a MiG to catch up. So at 1347, just a few minutes after they took off, the two targets merged. They could see the targets come together. And then a few seconds later, or a few minutes after that, the Connie disappeared. No more radar signature for the Constellation, and it was gone. And then at 1400, 2 o'clock, the MiGs disappeared. They're gone. So they saw them head back to land, but they lost them at about 2 o'clock. So they were airborne about 45 minutes, which is about how long a MiG is going to be airborne. This right here is an Atoll A2 missile. It's a Sidewinder missile in the US military, and it was a missile that ended up in the side of a MiG that didn't detonate and was captured by the Chinese and reverse engineered. So they reverse engineered the Sidewinder to get this missile. It's an IR missile, which means infrared, has a heat signature, so it goes right for the PRTs. It appears that this missile, looking at the wreckage that was found later, exploded underneath the left wing, rather close, and caused the left wing of the aircraft to separate from the fuselage. There's major damage to the radome. That's how they determined that on the left-hand side. I suspect Lieutenant Commander Overstreet, he's got the guys in the back talking to him. They're seeing the target. He's trying to get to the east as fast as he can. North Koreans, they have not encountered North Korean MiGs before. They encountered the Russians, but not the North Koreans. They don't know what's going on. He can't see behind him other than the radar. He's got a radar. They can see on radar. The radar blip doesn't tell you it's a MiG-21, but it will tell you it's a fast-moving airplane. And if it doesn't come up with the appropriate IFF code, which is like a transponder basically, it's an enemy airplane. So these guys saw the thing closing all the way in. They're probably talking to Lieutenant Commander Overstreet. Maybe he made a turn, don't really know, to take a look, to try and identify the aircraft positively, but the aircraft was behind him. One shot, probably separated the wing. The other missile, there was some damage on the other side, possibly, but not sure about that. So that happened at 1347, roughly. 147 is the best they can determine, give or take a couple minutes. So it took quite a while for the White House to find out. An hour, actually. A little over an hour. And they notified Henry Kissinger. You know, it's around midnight or so. You know, they notify Kissinger, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And here it is, Nixon has been in office 88 days. He's not going to take any crap from North Korea. And now they've shot down an airplane and it's missing. Or the airplane is missing. They really don't know yet, but they're guessing it's been shot down. Then shortly thereafter, 2 hours after the shoot down, 1347, so about 3:47 Korean time, the North Korean press is making announcements of a great military victory. Yeah. So it was Kim Il-jung's 57th birthday. So there's questions, was this a birthday present from the generals? You know, it would not be unusual. But because they made an announcement within 2 hours, they don't think that it was a screw up. They think it was a planned deal. Otherwise, they would have been a little bit slower announcing. So Kissinger got the news. He didn't tell Nixon anything for about 3 hours, 3 or 4 hours. And then he conferred with President Nixon. There's all kinds of stories about that. you know, why he didn't talk sooner and so forth. But anyway, they didn't talk for about 3 hours. And Nixon wanted to get going right away with a military action. And of course, this is a Cold War. So we got airplanes standing by, and those airplanes standing by are locked and loaded. So they had everybody standing by, ready to go, but they didn't go. Kissinger says, well, let's wait, find out more information, because information was pretty spotty. In the meantime, there was big communication snafus between the Air Force and the Navy. The VQ-1 squadron didn't find out their plane was missing for an hour and a half. They really didn't know. And the NSG group, who this airplane would check in with, had made several calls trying to figure out how come they couldn't communicate with the airplane. They didn't know. The Air Force sent out something called a critic message if something bad's happening, but unfortunately the Navy and the NSG group, or the Navy in particular, was not in on that message link. So they didn't find out for a couple hours also that their airplane was missing. Immediately launched a search and rescue mission. This is a picture of the Russian time, or a search and rescue mission. The first thing on the scene was a Russian destroyer, because we called the Russians and we said, hey, we got an airplane that we think is down, and explained the situation. So the Russians were the first there. They were there in about 12 hours, and they started finding debris. And we had some C-130s on the site. They saw some debris. Early on, everything was confusing. The VQ-1 CEO said there were survivors. They saw beacons, flares, all that stuff. All that was incorrect. But because of that, it has left some family members to kind of wonder what happened to their loved ones. There's some family members that are still thinking that their loved ones ended up in a prisoner of war camp in Korea. You know, could be, but highly unlikely for several reasons. One, the water temperature is 40 degrees. Two, they do have parachutes. You know, carry parachutes in the Connie. They were in the overhead, they're in the sides, and we occasionally have a parachute drill, which was usually a goat rope. Parachute drill took about 5 to 10 minutes to get the parachute on, and then we were all hollered at, and we'd have another parachute drill. It'd still take 5 to 10 minutes. You got harness and all the stuff, and you don't do it very often. So unlikely that they used any parachutes. Also, they had something called a poopy suit, which is the same thing, 5 to 10 minutes to get on. So unlikely that anybody got that stuff on and got out of the airplane before it fell out of the sky. So very unlikely, but there is 2 or 3 families that still think their loved ones went to a prisoner of war camp in Korea. Were picked up by the Soviets. This is like the next day. We had a conference with the North Koreans, and we're asking about the shoot down of our airplane. They're asking for some classified information about the airplane. So that's the general getting up and walking away. This is AT-1 Sweeney's wife. He was an ECM operator. He was an electronics operator. He would have been listening. This was April 17th. The reason and he's got a son in there that's about 7 years old, and he was found April 17th. So he and Lieutenant Rebar were the only 2 that got to come home. And the same thing with ADR-1 Sweeney. He was severe trauma from high impact forces, and hard to identify. That was April 17th they found him. And April 18th was the first time that Nixon addressed the nation. So this happened on the 15th, and nothing was said. It was business as usual because they didn't know what to do. You know, do we nuke them? Do Do we shoot some missiles? Do we have a military blockade? And there was a lot of discussion between Nixon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and everything else. 31 crew members and an airplane gone. They were 90 miles off the shore. Radar proved all that. So what did we do? Well, we ended up doing nothing. But April 18th, Nixon did make a speech to the nation. Why did we do nothing? Well, height of the Vietnam War. The one thing we did do was we sent the 7th Fleet over, 4 aircraft carriers. And they were over there for a couple weeks, you know, for a show of military power. But they didn't have any mission. They just drove around doing flights, showing our strength, but really not doing anything. So there's ADR-1 Sweeney, 30 years old. He would probably be considered a lifer also, meaning he's going to stay in the Navy and retire. This is Lieutenant Dennis Gleason. And he was an evaluator. He has a brother, Keith Gleason, kid brother Keith Gleason, who just really looked up to him. This was probably taken right around Christmas time in Japan. That's his young daughter and his wife. His daughter was about a year old, maybe a little bit. Actually, she was about 6 months old. His parents come to visit at Christmas, and he was, like I said, looked up to by his younger brother, and he wanted to go on. He was he didn't really care for the Navy. He was, he didn't care for the air part of the Navy. He wanted to be an oceanographer. He was from Oklahoma. So he studied all this ocean stuff, joined the Navy thinking he's going to be an oceanographer, ended up as a evaluator on an EC-121. So he was waiting to get out and go back into oceanography somewhere. His brother, Keith Gleason, still thinks about him every day. Misses him a lot. He said, kind of brother that he remembers bouncing a check and he goes to the bank and they said, "Oh, don't worry about it, your brother took care of it." And he talks about his brother taking him everywhere, which was, kind of unusual, actually. It's Lieutenant Commander James Overstreet. When this happened, he had 3 boys. His wife was a teacher in Japan, and she was a music teacher, and she actually stayed in Japan till she finished the school year. He was known as Gentleman Jim, pipe smoker, well thought of by everybody. He had flown 82 of these missions since he'd been in BW-1. The crew had generally flown 50 missions. So he was well experienced, as was the crew. They all had special clearances for these missions, special training. His son, if you look at here, his son is right there, the youngest one, standing next to his mom. That's Joe Overstreet, now retired Lieutenant Commander Joe Overstreet. And he retired as a helicopter pilot. He didn't have any desire to actually be in the Navy or anything. It just kind of happened by accident. And the next thing, he's a helicopter pilot, retiring as a lieutenant commander, serving at some of the same bases his dad did. And the interesting thing about Commander Overstreet is he's in civilian life now, living in the San Francisco Bay Area, basically doing the same mission as his dad on the ground as a civilian. And he's directing and coordinating surveillance flights for drones over Iran. So kind of interesting turn of fate all these years later, he's doing that. His 2 brothers, one brother died, the other brother just never really got over it and still having problems. Forgot to mention Hugh Lynch. Well, back there, we'll back up. Remember Staff Sergeant Hugh Lynch? his wife was pregnant with twins. So now you're 2 or 3 weeks from delivering twins, and your husband's gone instantly. So they put her in the hospital right away because they were worried about her health. And then after a few days, they let her go home. And then her mother come to Japan. They would not let her leave Japan until she delivered. So her mother come to Japan, delivered the twins in Japan, and then went back to the States. This is today. Everybody know this guy? Kim Jong. You know, I'm not going to go into the politics so much, other than, you know, it seems like history is history. Same thing, right? Here he is in a jet. He likes jets. So what does that mean? I don't know. I'm not making any speculations. But that's what's going on today. We got some of the same problems. Henry Kissinger, later on in his memoirs, there's no word there, but anyway, Henry Kissinger later on said, we screwed that one up. He said, we should have done something, and what we did, our lack of action has caused further problems with North Korea for ongoing administrations. And like I say, I'm trying to stay away from the politics. I'm focusing on the crews, but that's kind of what happened. And my goal here today is kind of put a personal face on this. So every year now, at April 15th, I would like it, or April 14th, maybe you'll remember, they have a remembrance somewhere every year, you know, and I think it's important that we remember what happened here. One of the quotes from a Navy piece of paper is, "The nation that forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten." So this year when you're doing your taxes, and it's April 14th, think about April 15th. And then if you could just bear with me, I'm going to switch out here. I have one more little short thing I want to do. By the way, all these guys were put in for the Silver Star. Guess what? They didn't get it. I don't know why. But just the crew. So I just look at these guys, and they're not here, and they should be. And it's the same thing today. You know, their names aren't on the Vietnam War because they weren't lost in the war. They were lost on a peacetime mission. So, but it really doesn't make any difference to their families, whether or not they were lost in the war or lost on a peacetime mission. So today, think about that. We got the same guys out there doing the same things, and be fancier equipment. And we got young men and women. They're doing our same missions. The oldest member of the crew, the evaluator. Denny Gleason, evaluator. Gene Graham, the youngest, 20 years old. His sister writes something about him almost every 3 or 4 days on Facebook. She still misses him. Senior flight engineer. Denny Horrigan. I got some great party pictures of Denny I didn't include. I mean, you know, these guys are 25 in the Navy. Kincaid, ATR-2 Kincaid, that would have been me. Crew leader. Hugh Lynch had the twins. All these guys had 2 or 3 air medals from flying in Da Nang. Typical mission to Da Nang would be 8 to 10 hours. We're gonna go off and talk. Da Nang, no doubt. Hot. John Miller. His wife, still friends with a Japanese lady that they got quite close to in Japan. Has never been back, but she talks to her 2 or 3 times a month. She left Japan about a week after this happened. She was sent home to St. Louis with a 1.5-year-old and no husband. There he is. Very well respected. I talked to his wife, Donna, quite a while. Lieutenant Commander Overstreet. Interesting story, Lieutenant Commander Overstreet. He was based in Pax River, Maryland. He was a fisherman. And he'd take the boys fishing and have a squadron party. And they would come back with a bunch of crab, blue crab. And they'd cook up the blue crab, and they had a refrigerator, and as Navy guys often do, the refrigerator had a little tap on the door. So they had the little tap on the door, and the beer would come out. Well, he put a tap on the door for the boys. So he had a beer tap and a milk tap. Boys drank a lot of milk. He was one of the, he was a co-pilot. This is a guy from NSG, referred to as one of the spooks. Pretty important guy. He was responsible for all the pre-flight duties, taking care of the airplane, which is a big deal in the Connie. Get a picture of everybody, unfortunately. Yeah, Chief Randall. He bumped somebody to get on his flight. And on the slideshow, if you were here at the beginning, Chief Randall was the guy with the ukulele and the wig. Sounds like a lifer chief, doesn't it? This is Lieutenant Rebar. He was one of them that come home. But the only way they could identify him was by his teeth. Molars. It's the work he had done. This is Sweeney, Richard Sweeney, AT-1. He got to come home too. Donna Miller, who was John Miller, she got her suitcase back. She took her suitcase to go to Japan, and she said that before he left, he was supposed to leave his wings and his ID card in a locker on base. She never got those back, but she got the white suitcase back that had his personal stuff in it. That was a recovered piece that the Russians recovered. This Mr. Taylor here, his wife has lobbied Congress for years to try and find out if they're in a prisoner of war camp. She believes that there were survivors that ended up in a prisoner of war camp. highly unlikely, but I'm not gonna take that from her. She lobbied Congress quite a bit. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions, comments, anything they'd like to? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, but I really want to focus on the crew, kind of, so you guys know who's not here and why. Anybody have any?
Is there any kind of memorial anywhere to these guys?
No, that's the sad thing. There's not. There's a couple plaques here and there. At the Navy cryptology place, there's a plaque. And there's a plaque one or two other places, but far as a memorial for the whole crew, nothing. They've been lobbying to get something, but nothing has transpired yet. Anybody else? I'd like to thank you all for your time. I would like to thank also my wife for letting me ignore her for a couple of weeks while I've been doing research. DC 129 for their sacrifice, and think about it when you do your taxes. Thank you.